Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this session honoring Susan Fiske and listening to her speak. I'm Mahzareen Banaji. The James McKeen Cattell Fellow Award is APS's highest honor to recognize individuals for a lifetime of significant intellectual achievements in applied psychological research and impact on a critical problem in society at large. It is my distinct honor to introduce to you the 2017 recipient, Susan Fiske. Susan Fiske is one of a handful of the world's most distinguished psychologists, known for her groundbreaking research in the field of social cognition. She was there, fortunately for us, as the field was being invented. And she is part of a small group of visionary people who laid the foundations of my field of social cognition, planting the first studies so that the rest of us might know where to go in the wilderness of the 1980s. Susan has spent a great deal of her career on questions concerning the role of social groups and everything that groups facilitate and obstruct. Her work has warned us about the ease with which we dehumanize the homeless and revel in the ill fortune that befalls a rich 1%er, and why even seemingly harmless stereotypes can impede the path to equality. The impact of her work goes far beyond the academy, as is evident in the critical role she played in Hopkins versus Price Waterhouse, a case that was eventually decided by the Supreme Court. It is evident in her contributions to President Clinton's Race Initiative Advisory Board. Susan Fiske's work forces us to contend with the human mind, not in isolation, but in relationships and in groupings, for that is where life happens. It's when minds meet and must jointly make sense of each other and of the world. How to live, how to love, how to get along, how to make great things happen collectively for the future of the planet and its inhabitants, whoever they might be. Susan has studied what can get in the way of these aspirations and how to outsmart our own minds to realize society's fullest potential. She speaks with a clear and authoritative voice. I chuckled once when reading a chapter of hers in which she basically said that people who defend the use of stereotypes can do so, but they must know this, that they're in conflict with 50 years of civil rights law. What she was subtly saying is that the law and governments do not act with the swiftest speed, and to be out of sync with the law of the land meant that you were destined to be on the wrong side of history. Of course, I cannot take credit for any of Susan's professional accomplishments, as I have been but an admirer on the sidelines, much as a slightly younger sister watches an older sister with jaw-dropping awe. But many years ago now, I was invited to sit on a panel engaged in some critical work on the future of the social sciences, and much to my regret, I could not participate. I recommended strongly that Susan be invited, and that's where Susan met Doug Massey, a distinguished and celebrated sociologist, and they were married soon thereafter. So what I can say is that I take sole credit for Susan's personal happiness. Susan Fiske received her BA and PhD from Harvard University, where she worked with the formidable Shelley Taylor. She taught at CMU and the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and is currently Eugene Higgins Professor of Psychology and Professor of Public Affairs at Princeton University. She has literally written the book Social Cognition, which is currently in its 3rd edition. And she has contributed more than 350 articles and chapters that teach us so much about ourselves and the social world. Susan is a member of the National Academy of Sciences. She was past president of this organization, the APS, a William James Fellow Award recipient of the APS, and has received the APS Mentor Award. With the Cattell Award today, to the best of my knowledge, she's the only person in the world to have received all 3 of APS's highest honors. As you know, Susan's work has shown that the qualities of competence and respect on the one hand are often orthogonal to the qualities of warmth and liking. They tend to trade off. People who are high on one tend to be lower on the other. In opposition to her own theory, I give you Susan Fiske, respected and beloved. Welcome, Susan. So amazing.
Well, that introduction was so great that I feel like I should just leave it there. This is one case where the introduction is going to be better than the talk. So what I'd like to do today is talk to you about our little theory of how people think about other people and other groups in society, and how what people report to us on an individual level about how people view other people and other groups in society actually correlates with societal level variables. So it's sort of a mini theory that seems to work at a global level, much to our amazement and gratitude. So this starts with the stereotype content model, but let me give you the overview, and then if you feel like you've heard it before, you can leave. I'm going to be talking about how this ambivalent stereotyping, which is what operates in the minds of individuals, links to national indices of inequality and peace conflict. The argument is that stereotypes go beyond valence, and we've found that good evidence that warmth and competence are dimensions that people use universally. I'll say why I dare to use a word like universally, which is provocative and dangerous. Frequently, warmth and competence operate ambivalently, that is, groups are seen as high on one and low on the other, as Mazarine anticipated. And the implication of this is that these ambivalent stereotypes reflect society in a couple of ways I'm going to highlight. One is, I will argue that income inequality predicts ambivalence for reasons that make sense once you think about it, and also that peace and conflict at a societal level also predict ambivalence. So this ambivalence on warmth and competence serves functions for a society. This work is built on the stereotype content model, which is, as I said, the idea that stereotypes go beyond just valence, just beyond I love us and I hate them. It's work developed with Amy Cuddy and Peter Glick. The basic premise is really quite simple. The first thing you need to know about another individual or about a new group, say, that's coming to our country is what are their intentions toward us? Do they intend us good or ill? It's like the sentry who calls out in the night, halt, who goes there, friend or foe? It's the first thing you need to know, and arguably it has survival mechanisms. This decision about what the other intends toward you is fundamental, but the second thing you need to know is whether the other can act on that intent, because if they can't act on that intent, then they're not consequential. If it's an angry bunny rabbit, who cares, except in Monty Python. So these two dimensions, very simple, pretty intuitive, turn out to be like something that explains everything from my point of view. Now, I realize I'm a little delusional about this, but let me see if I can persuade you to share my delusion for a while. If you take the warmth by competence space at the cross-national level, it meets the eyeball test. That is, if you get people to describe the groups in their society on these two dimensions, the groups spread out across the space in a way that makes you feel like you're looking at a cultural map of that society, much as you'd be looking at a geographic map of a society to get insight about it. So here's a schematic of it. I'm a social psychologist. I love 2x2s. We have warmth high and low, competence high and low. In the low part of the space, you have people report to us all over the world, poor people, homeless people, immigrants, particularly undocumented immigrants. people report that these groups elicit disgust. So disgust is a pretty bad place to be. It's equivalent to being really dehumanized. Disgust can be directed toward a pile of garbage or an object. It's probably about the worst place to be. One of the things that's interesting about this cross-nationally is that groups that don't have an address, Roma or Gypsies, Bedouins, refugees, they all end up in this low part of the space. So it's worth thinking about why not having an address makes you so disgusting. I think probably because it makes you unaccountable and also incompetent. In direct contrast to this are the society's in-group and its allies and reference groups. So middle-class people all over the world, full citizens of that country, they're seen as both warm and competent. So they're kind of the icons for that society. So this much good, bad you could get from any intergroup relations theory. This is not an innovation of ours. But what is an innovation are the ambivalent quadrants. So groups that are seen as well-intentioned but incompetent include older people and people with disabilities, either mental or physical, all over the world. And by the way, the older person stereotype of being sort of pitiful is true everywhere. And somebody will say, what about East Asia? No, it's true there too, it turns out. So pity is an ambivalent emotion. It says, I feel sorry for you, but you have to stay below me. If you get too uppity, you sacrifice the pity. The other ambivalent quadrant is rich people and professionals and people who teach at Ivy League universities. So they're the objects of envy, which says, you have something I wish I had and I'd like to take it from you if I can. So envy and pity are both ambivalent emotions and they're both in the ambivalent cells, whereas pride and disgust are univalent. And the universal aspect of this is that all over the world, rich people land in the same envy quadrant, poor people land in the low part of the space, old people land in the pity part of the space, and middle-class people land in the high part of the space. And then depending on the country, different ethnic groups plug into these four quadrants, depending on its history, depending on what's going on with immigration in the country and the politics of the time. So the overall model is that the images of warmth and competence are caused by social structure. That is, people's perceptions of whether a group is competitive and exploitative or cooperative. That determines whether they're seen as trustworthy and warm. And if they're high status or low status, that determines whether they're seen as competent or not. The prediction of competence from status is basically meritocracy. High status people are competent, low status people are incompetent, people deserve what they get. It's meritocracy. It's not just an American belief, it's true everywhere. The correlations are like 0.8 or 0.9. It's kind of surprising. So social structure is the upstream predictor variable, and we'll come back to that. These stereotypic images are what I've been talking about, the unique emotions for each quadrant, and then there are unique patterns of behavior that result. And this matters because different kinds of discrimination will be directed at different kinds of outgroups. So let me just say what our basic method is. In the first phase of going to any place, what we do is we get informants to nominate the groups in that society. You don't need very many people to do it, it turns out, because there's a lot of consensus. And what we do then is take groups that are mentioned by at least 15% of the sample, because we assume that these are groups that people will understand as being in common discourse. Then in the second phase of the research, we get people to rate between 16 and 30 groups. You don't need very many adults to do it because what we're asking them is, in society's view, how are these groups seen? There's consensus about that too. Even if you're a member of the group, you know how people see your group. We have them rate them on warmth and competence, competition and status, and the emotions and behaviors. The group becomes the unit of analysis at that point. So the group's ratings on warmth and competence determine where it fits in the overall map. And so then we plot the means in the warmth by competence space. Here's a representative sample survey we did a while ago. This is actually an exception to the getting informants to tell us about the groups. It's the only time we've done it this way. We had theoretical reasons for wanting to look at these groups, but it illustrates. So if you look in the high part of the space, what you see is, for example, Christians and Americans, middle class people. These are sort of default in the American case. I'm not going to go into other groups right now. In the low part of the space, you have people on welfare and poor black people. Poor white people land in the same exact spot. It doesn't matter what race you are if you're poor. Notice that homeless people are outside of the cluster analysis. That's because their rating is 3 standard deviations out from from the mean of the other groups, which means they're technically in a different population. In the warm but incompetent part of the space, you see older people and people with disabilities. In the envy part of the space, you see rich people, and in the United States at this time, Asians and Jewish people are also seen in that part of the space. So this illustrates the kind of map that we can generate. And the emotions that are directed at these groups are the ones that are predicted by the theory. So the cluster analysis is validated by the correlation of the clusters with the groups, with the emotions that we theoretically predict. We also see it in images of different kinds of immigrants in the United States. I'm not sure if you can read it, but in the high part of the space are Americans as a sort of anchor group, but European immigrants, third-generation immigrants, they're Americans, except for the Canadians who are better than us. And when you look in the low part of the space, the immigrants that I was mentioning before as being in the discussed quadrant, it's mainly undocumented immigrants and Latino immigrants and African immigrants. So when people talk about the immigrant problem, what they're talking about is people of color and undocumented people in particular. So in this particular situation, when we focus on immigrant status, Italians and Irish are seen as warm but incompetent, and Asian immigrants are seen as competent but not warm. So what this does is this helps you to think about how people imagine the immigrant issue in the United States to be. So these are just illustrations. A relentless pattern of data over a couple decades now leads me to say universal. We have data from US samples of all different kinds. It doesn't matter whether you spend the money to do a representative sample survey, because you get the same results if you ask a bunch of M-Turkers or students in your class. It happens in different countries. So by now I'll show you a map of where we have data sets from. The eyeball test is met, that is, the groups of each country ramify out across the space. It's also evident over time, to the extent that we don't have a time machine, we have other ways of looking back in time. One is Federica Durante did a content analysis of Italian fascist magazines describing different groups in society at the time in Italy from the fascist point of view. And what she did was independently recreate our two-dimensional space from content analysis of these descriptions. American students have been polled on their stereotypes since 1933 at Princeton, the Katz and Braley study, and the replications of that over the 20th century. And if you recode their 84 adjectives by competence and warmth, you recreate the space again. So it's not some modern, politically correct, all groups have some good points and some bad points kind of theory. And finally, as I've implied, it happens with subtypes. You can take subtypes of all different kinds of stereotypes. If people tell you what kinds of men and women there are, what kinds of gay men there are, and then ask about warmth and competence, the groups spread out across the space. So I said that intent was the unifying mechanism for warmth. Well, who else has intent? Other species, animals have intentions toward us. So it works for animals too. Who's like us? Our dogs and cats and horses, and then monkeys and elephants are smart. Who's sort of slimy and disgusting? Lizards and fish and snakes and rats. Who's competent but cold? The predators. And who's sort of pathetic? Hamsters, rabbits, cows, ducks. It's interesting to me that we eat the pathetic ones. I don't know. We won't go there. And then corporations are people too, right? So which corporations have good intentions and are competent? The all-American brands, Campbell's, Johnson & Johnson, Hershey's, Coke, which are sort of the disgusting ones, the troubled brands, as my tactful collaborator Chris Malone says. BP is an example of a disgusting brand. The luxury brands are competent but cold. And as a progressive person, I'm sorry to say that government agencies are incompetent but well-intentioned. That's what people report. And my publisher would want me to say that we have a book on it. Okay. So at this point, we have these cross-national comparative data. The original data came from all these places that are indicated here. The eyeball test was met, and also the correlations of these clusters with the emotions and with the structural predictors. So that's independent validation of the cluster analysis. So the pattern that we were getting at that point, up to that point, was high ambivalence. That is, there are groups in all four quadrants of the space. If you correlate warmth and competence, the correlation is very low. You're getting a pattern that's circular, basically, if you look at the shape of it, and the correlation is not significant. So we were all set to say ambivalent stereotypes happen everywhere. I was feeling pretty confident about that. But then, and even in South Africa, again, it's the same kind of thing. Different groups. It's culturally interesting to study it, but I'm not going to give you time to do that right now. But then we started to get a few sort of samples that look like this, which is more of a vector. And there is a correlation between warmth and competence, 0.65. That's hardly orthogonal. But, as a good scientist, I ignored the data. It's a fluke of some kind, it doesn't matter. But then it started to happen again and again. So Federica Durante came on board to work with me on this. Her motivation was that Italians were the only ones, she's Italian, Italians were the only ones that rated themselves in the pity cell. And so we said, how can this be about Italy? Why? Well, Berlusconi is one explanation, in which case Americans are going to be quick to follow. But I'm not supposed to be political, so I won't. So we were starting to gather more data from other Mediterranean countries. Maybe this is a Mediterranean thing. No, it's not. We looked at Catholic countries. No, it's not. Anyway, so in the course of pursuing that hypothesis, we were gathering more and more data through the miracle of the internet and collaborators who wanted to gather data in their country. And we ended up with, at that point, combining with the old data set and the new one, 37 national samples. And the average warmth competence correlation is about 0.4. Darn. Not exactly orthogonal. But there was a lot of variance. So, there's some ambivalence, but the range is big. The negative correlation is not significant, but so basically it's going from 0 to 0.9. So now paying attention to the data for a change, I said, okay, well then it's like a meta-analysis. If there's that kind of variability, you want to see what's causing it. Well, it turns out, and these were exploratory analyses, I'll be out front about that, ambivalence correlates with inequality. The Gini coefficient is an international indicator of income inequality, and the warmth competence correlation itself correlates with the Gini coefficient, 0.34. So it looks like this. The horizontal axis is the Gini coefficient. The more unequal countries are on the right, the more equal countries are on the left. There's less ambivalence as you go up. So for example, Switzerland, if I can get the pointer to work. So Switzerland, for example, is not ambivalent, but also very equal. And South Africa, which I showed you, is very unequal, but also very ambivalent. So you begin to get a picture that the more unequal countries have these ambivalent quadrants as if, and here's my story about this, as if they have more explaining to do. If you have a lot of income inequality, there are big gaps between people. So it's easier to maintain that kind of system if you say, well, they're deserving poor and undeserving poor. They're deserving rich and undeserving rich. So, you know, the poor people are varied, the rich people are varied, and you can't be too bent out of shape about it because it's complicated. We have some data that are consistent with this idea. Oh, here are two examples that I showed you before. So the structural predictors, you remember I told you that competence is predicted by status and warmth is predicted by competitiveness. So the standard correlation that status predicts competence is the meritocracy one. It's there. And that cooperation predicts warmth. It's smaller, but it's still significant and reliable. The Gini coefficient correlates with the prediction that competition is not nice. So the more equality you have, cooperation is especially warm. Think about it for a second. If you live in a country with a great big social safety net, then, you know, it's not particularly a nice thing to be a competitive jerk. But if you live in a country where everybody has to fend for themselves, then competition is more understandable and not so condemned. So the Gini also correlates with a link that we didn't predict, that is the link between competition and competence. So is it competent to be competitive? Undergraduates will often equate the two, right? This person's really competitive is a way of saying this person's really competent person. So this gets, you know, convoluted because it's correlations of correlations, but the basic point is the more equality you have, the more cooperation is a competent thing to do. So the more equality, cooperation is the done thing. It's warm and it's competent to cooperate because the government is going to take care of you. And we're all part of a big national unity. But in the Swiss case, for example, you saw that there was a big in-group on the vector, and then there are some groups that are beyond the pale who are refugees and Roma people, for example, who don't qualify as us. So what blows me away about this, you know, and it's my own data, so that seems immodest to say, but this really imperfect individual report of the cultural stereotypes correlates with national indicators of income inequality. I mean, you know, if we were measuring it better, how much better would the correlation be? But so this is what makes me excited about this work. But there are flies in the ointment. There are a couple countries that we noticed are way off the regression line. And they turn out to be Northern Ireland and Israeli Arabs. So what's going on with that? How come they don't fit the model? Well, I have a kind of carpet sweeper mind. I like things to be in clumps and to find similarities. They're both high conflict countries. Oh, okay. So maybe inequality is not the whole story. Maybe peace and conflict matter. So we were lucky with Federica Durante and I, with the help of Michelle Gelfand, to gather some data in the Middle East, which has some countries that score high on global peace conflict indicators. We also thought we should get some more countries that are the most peaceful, equal places on the planet, the Scandinavian countries, so we were able to find some collaborators there as well. and so we added to the data set. This is not p-hacking, by the way. We had an existing data set. We had a theory about what kinds of data we should be gathering in addition. We didn't, I can tell you, it's too much trouble to gather data cross-nationally, so we didn't like gather data, look at the p-value, and then gather more data. Here are the Norwegian data. The correlation between warmth and competence is 0.66. That fits the inequality story, so this is an equal, peaceful country. Most of the groups fall on the diagonal, and the low part of the space is drug addicts, beggars, and Roma people who are sort of beyond the pale and not part of the social safety net. The Finnish data also show less ambivalence. The correlation here is 0.33. It's a little more ambivalence, but still not zero. So when you update the inequality data, what you see is there's still a correlation in the low 30s, we still have these outliers, and Pakistan has now joined them. So this behooves us to look at the Global Peace Conflict Index. Pakistan looks a lot like Switzerland. What? I mean, that makes no sense, right? So what's going on? Let me back up a second, tell you what I think is going on. So there are a couple ways to have equality. One is to be at peace, but the other one is to be in conflict, which drags everybody down to the same lowest common denominator. So maybe that's what's going on with Pakistan. It's a thought. But this correlation is 0.92, so it's as if we're measuring the same thing twice. So this is definitely not showing a lot of ambivalence. So we were able to find, so the hypothesis came from looking at these outliers, and we found that there is in fact a global peace conflict index. It combines internal conflict like civil war and related disturbances and international conflict. And we found that the global peace conflict index relates to ambivalence. Unfortunately for me, having to explain this to you in a talk, it's not totally simple, but it is understandable. So hang in there with me for a second. So what you find on the peaceful side of the GPI is a linear relationship between more peace and less ambivalence. So that's the Scandinavian countries. So the more peace they have, the more they have harmony in the country, and there's, we're all in it together, and the less peace you have, the more that erodes and you start to have more ambivalence. But it's curvilinear, which makes it complicated, but then it's understandable. At the conflict end, the more conflict you have, the less ambivalence you have, because it's us versus them. So it's almost like there's two different phenomena going on in the two different halves of the space. Under peace, you can have a lot of national unity, and it's kind of us, the people in the social safety net, are national people of varied kinds, versus the people beyond the pale. But then when you have high conflict, it boils down to us versus them as well. So this curvilinear relationship is significant between peace and conflict and ambivalence, and the linear relationship is not significant. But there are outliers still. I have to say, though, that when you remove the outliers, the story doesn't go away. If you do a local regression without the Pakistan and Israeli Arab data, what you see is the left-hand part of the story stays put. The right-hand part of the story doesn't go away completely, but it's not linear. It's still not a linear relationship. So what we're doing about that is currently gathering data in a part of the world that we hadn't been before, where there are countries that qualify as high conflict countries. And we'll see whether this curvilinear relationship is robust when we add theory-driven additional samples. So this takeaway story I'd like to tell is that there's more ambivalence in places like the US and Mexico and Peru, where there's a fair amount of income inequality, moderate peace conflict, so the United States falls kind of in the middle of that peace conflict thing, and that the ambivalence makes diversity easier to deal with. I think it's not a coincidence that in the Americas we have a very long history of receiving immigrants, and so we have a complex story to tell about how our society works and how inequality works and who's us and who's not us and who's partially us and who's on what dimension. And so the ambivalence tells a story about the mixed up soup that our society is. Less ambivalence can occur in a place like the Scandinavian countries where you have more equality and more peace. So you've got national unity, national consensus around who's us, and then there are a few groups that are them, and so then you get this vector from good to beyond the pale. But you can also have less ambivalence when you have equality but conflict, and you have an us versus them story going on, and it preserves unity among the ones that are defined as us in those societies. So it's not as simple a story as I would have liked to have told, but I think it's a coherent story. So the takeaway then is stereotypes go beyond valence, warmth and competence. Now we have to put universally in quotation marks, but ambivalence occurs frequently. Income inequality clearly predicts ambivalence, and intermediate peace conflict also predicts ambivalence, like in the Americas with their long history of receiving immigrants. But the extremes of peace and conflict predict unity and univalent stereotypes. So our overall causal model is the framework for this. These images lead to different kinds of behavior, but the proximal causes of behavior, I want to remind you from other work that I can't go into here, are the emotions. So if people feel envy toward competent but cold groups, that predicts both going along to get along with those groups and also active attack and sometimes genocide. So that's a particular configuration that recurs around the world over and over. On the other hand, groups that are seen as ambivalently warm but incompetent, they don't elicit genocide, but they do elicit locking them up, taking care of them, but ignoring them socially. So those are very different kinds of discrimination that you would expect. And to the extent that different ethnic groups plug into these different quadrants, you would expect different kinds of discrimination directed toward them. But the emotions will tell you the most. So even though I've been talking to you about stereotypes, if you can find out what groups people find disgusting or enviable or pitiful, then you can predict the behavior that will result. If you want to change these things, what do you change? You change the upstream image, the upstream understandings of the social structure. So, for example, if you say there are immigrants coming to our country who are the dregs of their society and they're trying to exploit Americans and take away jobs, then you're going to think those groups are disgusting. If you say there are immigrants coming to our country, they are very highly selected because we make it hard to get here. They're very tough and determined and competent to get here in the first place because we make it so difficult. And on the other hand, they want to grow the economy because they want to send money home. That's a different structural narrative about why they're here. Different stereotypes follow and different emotions follow. So, I think that the most important thing is the social structure is the sort of furthest upstream variable. And there are narratives that we tell as a society and that politicians tell and exploit that then determine how the groups are viewed and the emotions that are aroused and the discrimination that results. So I want to thank my lab because all of this is done with collaborators, and I want to thank you for listening and for the honor of this award.